When I saw this sitting by the side of the road, I saw this beautiful solid wood piece. I had to save it. Little did I know, this would have to be taken completely apart and reassembled and need repairs I've never attempted before. My name is Sarah, and I like to take things that are ugly and beat up or pulled out of the trash and make them beautiful again. Welcome to my channel. It's obvious this piece is pretty beat up. It's been somebody's work table. There's paint all over the top. It's been nailed together in many places. The drawer front's not original because the original drawer front is cracked in, like, a chunk of the wood has been missing in two places. The inside of the drawer is completely disgusting and moldy. There are many places where the wood is cracked and not splitting as in a whole piece, but where pieces were glued together, it's splitting apart in many places. So this is going to require a lot of sanding and a lot of gluing and a lot of patching cracks and holes. So the question is, can I restore this to look good, or is it going to look like a hodgepodge hot piece of mess? I started off cleaning this with some TSP and a warm bucket of water, and I quickly realized this was way too rickety. This is not going to be a sand it down, fill some holes, and refinish this project. I needed to take this apart, and I will show you in a short amount of time what took me a good afternoon. I was surprised to see that these boards that the legs are attached to were eaten up with wormholes, so those will need replaced. I'm going to jump in real quick and explain what I'm doing. So this piece was nailed together in many places with these tiny nails, and the nail heads were sunk into the wood, so I couldn't grab them out. And so with basic tools, I had to figure this out, and I took the crowbar and tried to pry it apart so that the nails got sucked into the wood I'm trying to get it out of. And then I went and hammered the wood either from the front or from the other side back together to try to hammer it back to where it was. And then by then the nail heads would be sticking out a little more, so then I could easily pry it out with the hammer. Remove these corner braces, one because they were rotting and I need to replace them, but also they were blocking one of the screw holes that I needed to get to detach the rim from the desktop. that's a lot of work that we've gone through so far, and we're only just at the beginning. So there's a lot of things that need glued back together, and I'm going to quickly walk through them. So the frame for the desk drawer had some cracks in it. I needed to glue those together. I did these over a series of days because I only have so many clamps, and I like to leave things clamping overnight. So there were 2 cracks on the drawer frame, and then that board on the base of this desk, the corners were kind of cracking off, and the boards were pulling apart that had been glued together to make this huge one piece. So I had to glue and reattach all of those. The one piece that had someone stuck a nail through it to hold it on, and I decided to leave the nail in because I thought it would give it more support. So normally I pull things out, but this one I left in, and I'll just patch the nail head hole when it's all done. And one of the things that I did to try to get things pressed flat, and I did this on the desktop as well, was using a 2x4 clamped along the width of the long pieces to help pull them up, because this one long board was really sagging, and I was trying to straighten it up, and I think it helped. Here's a tiny piece that needed glued on the bottom side of the rim that goes around the bottom of the desktop. I don't know where this was stored, but the wood was very damp feeling, so I let it bathe in the sun to dry out for a whole day. And once I felt like the wood felt nice and dry, I was ready to start working with it and gluing things back together. Now, this desktop was daunting to me because I had never glued wood together to make a flat, large surface. So what I did was I used the orbital sander to sand down all the flat surfaces, the larger surfaces, but the edges where I'm going to be gluing together, I hand sanded because I did not want to beat up the corners. I've done this on a table before, and then the wood doesn't fit together tight, so I just hand sanded with 220 grit sandpaper to just kind of get any excess glue left over off and get a nice clean finish. And I did have to buy some more clamps to make this work, but I did the best I could, and I learned as I went along. But I was able to glue the sides together and clamp it down, and then I used I don't know what you call them, but I used 2x4s to clamp down to make sure that the board stayed flat as they were being clamped together. And I repeated this process with every board. So I glued 2 boards together. Once that was dry, I glued the next board on. Once that was dry, I glued the next board on. And I kind of got the hang of it as I went along, and my seams got better. I did find out when it was all said and done, I glued one board the wrong direction, so that did mess up the smoothness of it, and the bottom side did have glue popping through, but that's nothing I can't just sand off and sand down, so that's okay. I don't mind if the bottom's lumpy. I want the top to be smooth. So once I got all the boards glued together, we're ready to do like a final smooth sanding on all of it. And this took some time because I let it sit for about 24 hours before I'd go on to the next board. But I was pleased. I was pleased with how this turned out. With my rudimentary skills and tools, this turned out just fine. I wasn't able to sand all of the paint stains and other water stains out when I sanded it originally, so I used oxalic acid to try to bleach the stains out, and that helped. I was pleased. I probably did this 2 or 3 times. I've heard once you've done it a 3rd time, if it's not bleached to where you want it, it's probably not going to make any difference to go any further. So bleached that out, and it was enough. This has a rustic look anyway because it's really old and pretty beat up, so I'm not going to be picky about that. The under rim of the desktop came apart a little bit, and so I needed to glue these small pieces back on, and I debated how tight to glue these on because they, I think, needed some wiggle, but I went for it and I glued them on, and it was actually challenging to get them glued on without them angling in, and I did the best I could and figured when I go screw it on the desktop, I'll just use some force and pull it out, which is probably not the best idea, but that's what I did. This next step that I did, as I'm watching myself do this in the video and recording this, I feel so sad and mournful that this was the worst thing I could have done for my flip. And this is why I question if it was a flop. I regret filling all these crags and cracks with wood filler. And you can see at the end and decide if you think this was a bad choice. As I feel, I am normally thinking get everything smooth so I can paint, although I knew I was not painting this, probably just a whitewash. I thought, I will blend all this filler in with my whitewash. It will be fine. Well, stick around to the end and you decide if it turned out fine or if it would have looked better if I just left these all open. I didn't have the tools to make a new drawer front if I had bought a raw piece of wood, so I racked my brain to try to figure out how I can salvage this drawer front and continue to use it. And I came up with the idea to build a makeshift frame and fill the corners with Bondo, and then I figured I could do a rough but thicker whitewash on the Bondo to cover the color and it'll be fine. This was definitely a risk, but I was intrigued to see if I could make this work. Once all that filler was dry, I just used the orbital sander to sand it all smooth. I probably just used a 220 grit sandpaper. Then on the tight areas, I just hand sanded. Now on the bottom side of the desktop, I decided to fill all the holes that were used before to attach that rim. And I'm just using skewers and cutting it down to the depth of the hole and gluing them in with wood glue and then coming back and covering them with putty, the wood filler, to make them smooth. Now on to reassembling the drawer. I think that looked pretty good with the Bondo all sanded nice and smooth. I did have to take a little minute and keep sanding down where the Bondo part hit the other board that was coming in so that it was nice and smooth and had a nice tight joint. But once I had that sanded to where I was happy with it, I glued the drawer front onto the rest of the frame. See those streaks that kind of look wet? That is glue, and I've got to get that sanded off in order for my whitewash to adhere properly. I did have a screw break off when I was taking this apart and had to get creative in ripping it out, but after some twisting, we got that out. Then I sanded it smooth so it would sit flat against the tabletop. Now it's finally time to assemble, and I put this off for a while because I was so nervous that it would take a lot to get this put together, and then it would look terrible because I'd do it wrong and it would just be ruined. So I finally convinced myself to finish this project, and I spent a lot of time trying to attach this rim to the bottom side of the desktop. And I had to make sure that I had plenty of room for the drawer to slide in and out. But this front piece, while it is two small pieces on the side and the drawer front, it is one piece of wood that was cut for the drawer. So I want to get it as close together as possible without a gap. And like I said earlier, these short end pieces were kind of leaning in, so I had to kind of finagle that. Got my foot up there at one point to try to push it in the right place. And then I used a little screw and stabbed it through the drill holes in the frame to mark where I needed to drill a hole. And I got the first two drilled, and then I realized I didn't line it up properly around the whole rim of the base. So I filled those holes again with the skewers and wood glue, let those dry. And I came back to it and I felt more confident and marked my spots and went through and drilled pilot holes, because let me tell you, red oak, which this entire thing, other than the innards of the drawer, is red oak, and that is hard wood. Although the older wood's not too bad, but I bought some new wood and that was hard. So once I got the frame on, I needed to screw on the rails for the drawer. And again, I just left the drawer in, did my little trick with marking with my nails to poke through, did some pilot holes, and screwed those on. If you notice these screws are brown, it's because they're the original and they're kind of rusty, but I scrubbed them up as best I could and was happy to reuse as much as I could. And look at how nice that drawer fit. Okay, so it didn't really fit perfectly. I had to sand down some of that Bondo part, but that's okay because that wasn't hard to sand at all. And then I needed to put some drawer stops to stop the drawer from going all the way in. Before, it had that big board nailed to the front of it or screwed to the front of it, and that stopped it from going all the way in. It had drawer stops. You can see I filled the holes from before, so I just cut these little wood pieces that were in the bottom side of the desk. I assumed to hold the boards together because you saw it just fell apart when I took the frame off. So I used this as drawer glides, and I couldn't reuse the nails because they were just all bendy. Remember, this is hardwood, and they were kind of already bent. So I just glued it on, and I taped it and put these heavy stones on there. When I glued the drawer front onto the frame, I left the bottom panel in to help keep everything square, but it still needed tacked down so that it wouldn't slide out while using it. I also flipped that bottom panel over because the inside was a nasty stained mess and the bottom side looked better, so I flipped it over before nailing it down. It took a lot of brain power to figure out which part do you start assembling because I didn't have instructions. I knew how I took it apart, but that didn't mean that's how you put it back together, in that order. So I did my best, and I think I did okay. It worked out. I put the bottom piece together. So these support pieces went across perpendicular to the length of the board to help give it extra support. So I got those pilot holes drilled and screwed in, and then I attached the feet on the bottom, which again just used all the original hardware and, got those tightened down. The wood used to attach the desktop to the legs was rotted, and I had to get new wood to replace those so that this could be strong again. I bought an 8-foot red oak board. I had bought pine and then realized pine is really soft, and that was a bad idea. But it was so much cheaper than the red oak. But I went back and I bought the red oak so that it matched the wood to the desk and would be nice and solid, good for attaching this desk to. So I had to cut some small pieces, which is where the base frame got screwed onto the desktop, and then I needed to cut some longer pieces that attached the legs to. I'll show you here in a minute. So once I got those pieces cut, and then I had to figure out the exact size to cut these little boards down. Now, something to note I learned in those short videos you see pop up when you're scrolling is that you do not want to screw wood into the end of a board, but you want to screw into the side of the board where you're not going into the grain parallel with it when you put a screw in, but perpendicular to the grains, if that makes sense. So I made sure that I cut these boards to where it was the length that I was screwing into versus the end, if that makes sense. So I had to pare them down a little bit and cut a little extra off. But once I got it to what I thought would be a good height for screwing all the things together, I cut all 4 the same size and glued them in the corners inside the desktop. Once I got those pieces cut to the right size, I went back to those support pieces that I glued on, and I wanted to nail them in because the original ones were nailed in as well. And I just picked up 1.25 inch nails, and I thought it'll be fine, but my goodness, this oak is so hard, it bent so many nails. I had to nail very carefully. I ruined more nails than I got into the wood, but I got those nailed in, so they're nice and solid. I had to replace these hanger bolts, where one end screws into the wood, and then the other end is more like a bolt, not a screw. And I thought, I'll just screw it in by hand. No, it doesn't work. I'll just grab some pliers. No, that doesn't work either. It was messing up the threads. So I just set that aside, but I did go to YouTube and found a video and found a solution. But before I did that, I went ahead and attached every leg to the bottom side of the base and got those nicely bolted down. I used the original pieces as a template to mark where I need to drill the holes on my new boards. Before drilling the holes, though, I held it up to the legs to make sure that it looked like, yep, I can get those bolts up into those holes okay. Once I felt comfortable with that, I went ahead and drilled one board and double-checked, yep, it fits on. Okay, we're going the right way. Now, the other 2 legs, I needed to screw the bolts in, and I found out that you can use jam nuts. And you put 2 of these nuts on your bolt and then crank them in the opposite direction to get them to hold tight to each other. and that acts as a bolt head, and you can then screw it down into the wood. And once you get it all the way in, you can unjam the nuts and then unscrew it and then do that to the next bolt that you need to put in. I was so excited because it was such a simple solution. I was like, somebody's really smart, and I love this. I was going to use 2 screws per end to attach the base to the top. That's what was in there before. And I needed to drill those pilot holes and then mark each end so that I made sure after I put these boards onto the legs that they made it back to the right pilot holes that were already drilled. So once those were marked, I could bolt those down onto the legs. Then we were ready to do the final step of assembling this, and that was move the base up on to the top so that we could screw it on. Now this is where things went a little bit awry. Even with my pilot holes, I snapped 3 of my 8 screws when screwing them in. And I had to be careful I didn't beat up the wood on my leg with my drill as I screwed it in. So this was a bit of a juggling act. It felt tight. I didn't worry about my screws breaking off. I just went with it. I cleaned up the whole piece by just wiping it down with a wet towel, and then we're ready to do this paint wash. And I first started with just solid paint covering the blue Bondo, and I wiped it a little, but I was trying to first get that saturated. And then I experimented with all kinds of ratios of water to paint mixture. And once I picked one that I thought I liked, I just went and covered the whole piece and wiped as I went, as you do with a whitewash. I did the piece upside down, and then after that dried, I flipped it over. And when I did the tabletop and that footrest top, I had to make up a new mix, and I actually ended up making it more watered down. So it ended up being a warmer color, which I liked, but then I took it outside, and you can see the contrast in the drawer front and in the legs, how much whiter they are. I didn't film this, but I quickly went over with a warmer white, did another wash, and that helped mute it a little. After letting the paint dry for a day, I came through and just did a quick wipe down before adding the top coat of a soft wax. And I covered the entire piece in it. I waxed on the whole piece, and then I came back with a white rag and I waxed off. And I buffed it till it was nice and soft and no longer sticky, and it just really made a bit of a warmer glow to the piece and softened some of the whiteness. As we're wrapping it up here, on the drawer, I think originally it would not have had any hardware. But because of all that Bondo patching I did, I needed to cover a raw spot in the center. So I found this piece of hardware that looked like it would fit with an antique piece. And once I got the hole drilled and measured and the piece put on, I did refresh the inside of the drawer with some Howard feed and wax. And let's look back at where we started. You can see where we came from. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you think I overdid it on the white, if it looks great. I did want a little more raw wood look, so I was a little disappointed, but as we get into the reveal, I think you'll be surprised at how great it turned out. I hope you have enjoyed this. I'll catch you in future videos, and until then, enjoy this final reveal.